In 1952, Boeing invested $16 million of its own money into a jet prototype it called the Model 367-80 before a single airline had committed to buying one. 4 years later, American World Airways placed an order for 20 of them on the 12th of October, 1955. The aviation world that greeted that order was still largely built around the rhythm of propeller engines, and almost everyone in it had serious doubts that what Boeing was building was something the traveling public was ready for. The piston airliner era had its own logic. Aircraft like the Lockheed Constellation, the Douglas DC-6, and the Douglas DC-7 were capable, commercially mature machines that the industry understood completely. They vibrated. They were loud in a specific way passengers had grown used to. They cruised at altitudes where travelers could feel their relationship to the air and the ground below. The DC-7C, the most capable piston transport in regular service by the mid-1950s, crossed the Atlantic in around 16 hours nonstop. That was impressive by any measure of the era, and yet within airline boardrooms, it had already started feeling inadequate. The engine technology behind it had reached a practical ceiling, and maintaining it was becoming progressively more expensive as the machines grew more complex to extract what little performance remained. Airlines were profitable with piston aircraft, but they could see the wall approaching. The pressure was not purely commercial. The world itself was accelerating. Business travel was growing. Governments were investing in international connections. The audience for long-distance air travel was broader than it had ever been, and that audience wanted the journey to take less time. In October 1955, Juan Trippe, the chairman of American World Airways, attended a gathering of senior airline leaders in New York and announced that Pan Am had just ordered 20 Boeing 707s and 25 Douglas DC-8s, 45 jet aircraft at a combined cost of $269 million. The announcement ended the party. The executives in that room understood immediately that they had to follow or lose market share on every route Pan Am served. Boeing, learning from Trippe's announcement that Douglas was building a wider DC-8, hastened to redesign the 707's fuselage to match it. The jet age had not yet happened. The orders had already made it inevitable. Boeing's program director for what would become the 707 was Maynard Pennell, a veteran of the B-29 Superfortress development. The $16 million bet on the Dash 80 prototype had been authorized by Boeing President Bill Allen before a single customer had spoken, which for a company that derived nearly all of its revenue from military contracts in the early 1950s was not a cautious decision. The Dash 80 first flew on the 15th of July 1954 from Renton Field in Washington State, and in August 1955, Boeing's test pilot, Tex Johnston, flew it over Seattle's Lake Washington during the Gold Cup hydroplane races, attended by airline executives Boeing had specifically invited, and performed 2 barrel rolls in the prototype jet transport in front of an audience that included people who could write enormous checks. Johnston's explanation to Bill Allen the following day was that he was simply selling airplanes. Pan Am's order followed in October. By the way, if you're into stories like this, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and there's a lot more coming. The production 707 that emerged from the Dash 80 program was not the same aircraft as the prototype. Pan Am's insistence on 6 abreast seating forced Boeing to widen the fuselage beyond what the Dash 80 had established, a change Boeing resisted and then made because Pan Am was the customer and the DC-8 was being built to accommodate the wider layout from the start. The first production 707-120 first flew on the 20th of December 1957. FAA certification followed on the 18th of September 1958. Boeing delivered the first aircraft to Pan Am on the 15th of August 1958, registered N707PA and named Clipper America, and Pan Am immediately put it into crew training. The aircraft that emerged from that program looked genuinely unlike anything commercial aviation had produced. The 707-120 was 145 feet and 1 inch long with a wingspan of 130 feet and 10 inches. 4 Pratt & Whitney JT3C-6 turbojet engines, civilian versions of the military J-57 that powered the B-52, were mounted in pods under the wings in a configuration that had never appeared on a passenger aircraft before. The swept wing, which Boeing had developed from its B-47 bomber program, was the key to the speed. The cruising speed of the 707 was 575 miles per hour. Its nearest propeller-powered competitor, the DC-7-C, cruised at around 350 miles per hour. That gap was not an incremental improvement. It was the difference between one era of aviation and another. The initial 707-120 was designed for transcontinental routes and required a fuel stop on transatlantic services, which Pan Am managed with a stop at Gander, Newfoundland. The longer-range 707-320 intercontinental, with a larger wing and more fuel capacity, first flew on the 11th of January 1958 and entered Pan Am service in August 1959, giving the aircraft genuine transoceanic range without intermediate stops. Boeing would go on to build 856 commercial 707s before production ended in 1979. Total 707 production, including military variants, reached 1,010 aircraft. The airports were not ready. Among the specific infrastructure problems facing the introduction of jet service were the absence of jet fuel supply facilities at most airports, the lack of tugs capable of towing an aircraft of the 707's weight, the inadequacy of existing passenger stairways, and hangars that could not accommodate the aircraft for overhaul. American Airlines had to construct new ground facilities before it could open its own jet service in January 1959. The infrastructure that passengers take entirely for granted today, the jetways, the wide taxiways, the fuel farms, the heavy tow vehicles, was built in a matter of a few years specifically because the 707 and its competitors demanded it. Pan Am's 1957 annual report to shareholders, written before the first revenue flight had taken place, stated that the new jet fleet would telescope greater technical advance in speed, comfort, range, and capacity than had been achieved over the previous 30 years. That turned out to be accurate. Within 2 years of the 707 entering service, piston airliners had ceased to be viable on major routes. Douglas stopped manufacturing the DC-7 in 1958. The Lockheed Constellation was retired from American mainline operations before the mid-1960s. Aircraft that had defined long-distance travel for 15 years became financially untenable almost immediately because no airline could compete with jet schedules using propeller aircraft on the same routes. The economic consequences ran deep. Pan Am had introduced economy fares alongside the 707's inaugural service in 1958. The combination of jet capacity and lower per-seat operating costs made it possible to price transatlantic travel below what the piston era had sustained. That repricing accelerated the democratization of air travel. Flying had been, through the propeller era, an experience available to business travelers and the wealthy. The 707 did not make it universal overnight, but it moved the price point significantly. By the time Boeing had delivered several hundred aircraft and the competition between the 707 and the DC-8 had fully developed, the global route network was transforming around what jets made viable. Non-stop connections that had required refueling stops were being opened. Cities that had been commercially remote were becoming accessible. Tourism expanded into markets that propeller-era economics could not have reached. Flying also changed emotionally in a way that was harder to account for at the time. The propeller airliner had a physical relationship with the air around it that passengers could feel continuously. Weather affected piston travel in a direct, immediate way. Cruising altitudes were low enough that the ground was visible and recognizable. The rhythm of the engines was a constant sensory presence. None of those things were true of the 707 at cruise altitude. The aircraft sat above most weather, moving at a speed that made the landscape below effectively irrelevant to the experience of the journey. The sense of being in motion, of physically crossing a distance, was present on takeoff and landing, and then largely absent for the hours in between. What the 707 offered instead was efficiency and predictability. The journey from departure gate to arrival gate became something closer to a procedure than an experience. The last scheduled Boeing 707 passenger flight in the United States was a Transworld Airlines service from Miami to New York in 1983. Iranian Saha Airlines operated commercial 707 services until 2013. At its peak, the type was operated by Pan Am, TWA, American, Continental, Qantas, BOAC, Lufthansa, Air France, El Al, Singapore Airlines, and dozens of other carriers across every region of the world. Bill Allen's $16 million bet in 1952, before a single airline had committed to buying anything, turned Boeing from a military contractor into the dominant manufacturer in commercial aviation. The 7X7 series that followed, the 727, the 737, the 747, the 757, the 767, the 777, each of them carrying the fuselage cross-section dimensions and the design philosophy that the 707 established, those aircraft have carried more human beings to more places than any other series in the history of aviation. And the line from the Dash 80's first flight on the 15th of July, 1954, to a 737 MAX on final approach into any airport in the world today is unbroken. What the people who flew on the 26th of October 1958 experienced was not just faster travel. They were experiencing the moment the world changed its pace, and most of them had no framework to understand what that meant while it was happening. The jet age had been anticipated for years. The reality of it, the screaming engines, the aggressive climb, and the sudden smallness of the ocean below, was something else entirely. If this story was worth your time, hit like and subscribe, and drop what you think in the comments.